The return felt wrong. The cab pulled away from the curb near Canary Wharf, leaving me alone with my suitcase and the oppressive silence of the high-rise foyer. I was 3 weeks early. 3 weeks early, and I hadn't told Ethan. It was supposed to be a surprise. A grand gesture after a grueling stint closing a complex deal in Frankfurt. A spontaneous reunification after a long stretch of professional distance. Instead, I felt like an intruder walking into a house that had forgotten my existence. I keyed the access code to our apartment on the 28th floor. The lock clicked, a familiar metallic sound, but as the door swung inward, the air inside hit me first. Not the usual sterile, faintly citrus scent of the weekly cleaning service, nor the warm, comforting aroma of Ethan's favorite strong Earl Grey tea. This was l'odeur étrangère, the strange scent. It was lavender, certainly, but not the deep, musky lavender I sometimes used for winding down on tense evenings. This was high-pitched, almost saccharine, layered with a cheap, sweet, synthetic floral note. It smelled young, alarmingly, aggressively young. A perfume worn by someone trying too hard, or perhaps someone not trying at all because they felt perfectly entitled. A thin, cold sheet of apprehension settled over my skin, far worse than the jet lag I should have been feeling. I dismissed it instantly. It must be a new air freshener, perhaps something Ethan bought on a whim. He often did that when I was away, trying to inject some superficial personality into the clinical space we shared. A small, nervous voice inside me whispered that this was more than superficial. I pulled my suitcase inside, the wheels whispering across the polished wooden floor. The apartment was pristine, immaculate, a testament to the efficient, structured life we led. Ethan Hayes, the director of engineering, was obsessive about order. I, Avery Hayes, the marketing strategist, was obsessive about flow. Together, we had built a home of perfect, unblinking equilibrium, a fortress of predictability. But the equilibrium was broken. I stopped in the living room. The large, custom-made throw pillows on the cream leather sofa were unevenly plumped. Ethan always used the karate chop method to crease them down the middle. It was an immutable law of our domestic physics. These were just slightly shifted, rounded, as if someone had spent hours curled up against them recently, carelessly, leaving the imprint of a small head and frame. The sight made my throat tighten. On the coffee table, a stack of tech magazines, Wired and The Economist. Ethan filed them religiously by date of arrival, newest on top, an inch-perfect column. Now, the Wired from 2 months ago sat awkwardly resting on the current issue. A trivial thing, an insane thing, a clear signal that the meticulous hand I knew was not the last hand to touch them. My mind started spinning stories, quick, sharp, defensive ones. Ethan had a colleague over, perhaps his recently hired executive assistant. A sudden, unexpected client meeting late at night. The cleaning lady brought her child. Anything but the truth. I needed to see him, to feel the familiar weight of his arms, to hear his voice, so I could crush this irrational, growing panic. The truth was suddenly a gaping maw, and I was terrified of falling in. I moved through the apartment, each step slow, measured, as if walking on glass. The hallway, usually lined with our carefully curated wedding photos from 7 years ago, seemed suddenly cold, the smiling faces of our younger selves distant, strangers. I remembered the message he sent yesterday. Long day, exhausted, going to bed early, miss you. The text now felt hollow, a cheap performance. I reached the bedroom door. I took a deep breath, fighting the sudden urge to flee, to grab my bag and drive away until I could process whatever this was. I twisted the handle. The room was neat, too neat. The duvet was pulled up too perfectly flat, lacking the casual, rumpled character of a bed slept in by one person. It looked scrubbed clean of evidence. I walked straight to his side of the wardrobe. I opened the drawer where Ethan kept his nightclothes. He despised anything synthetic or rough. For our 5th anniversary, I had tracked down a specific, incredibly soft, Pima cotton sleep shirt he loved. It was the only thing he wore to bed. It smelled faintly of him, even after a wash. It was gone. In its place, folded with an almost brutal lack of care, was a pajama set made of heavy, scratchy linen. The kind of material Ethan would have winced at just touching. It was not his. The size was wrong too. Smaller, daintier, though still oversized on the frame of a very petite woman. My heart didn't race. it ceased. It became a heavy, inert stone in my chest, sinking me deeper into the floor. The feeling wasn't yet rage. It was a sickening, analytical clarity. The scent, the pillows, the misplaced magazines, the linen. A trail of breadcrumbs, leading straight to a certainty I had spent 7 years of marriage believing was utterly impossible. The betrayal wasn't a discovery. It was a confirmation of something the house had been whispering to me since I walked through the door. I left the bedroom and headed toward the back of the apartment, where the compact home office and the open-plan kitchen stood. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside our triple-glazed windows. I stepped into the office, his sanctuary. The ceramic mug I gifted him, the one that read, Tech Director, Caffeine Dependent, was gone from the desk. The faint, comforting scent of fresh, grassy green tea that usually clung to the room had been aggressively overwritten. Now, the air was thick with the scent of burnt espresso, the kind of cheap, strong instant coffee Ethan never touched. The signature of a visitor, someone who didn't know his routine or his distaste for cheap caffeine. And then I heard it. A small, rhythmic chopping sound coming from the kitchen island. Someone was in my kitchen. I walked the final few steps and stopped at the threshold. She was there, Chloe Abbott, 23, fresh out of university, and Ethan's new executive assistant. She was standing at the counter, humming tunelessly, wearing my favorite, slightly faded blue apron, the one with the small embroidered olive branch I brought back from Tuscany. It drowned her small frame. She saw me. The chopping stopped. Her eyes, large and wide, flickered with a strange, fleeting mix of terror and something else, a calculated confidence, a predatory gleam I hadn't expected from a young professional. The terror was for the immediate moment. The confidence was for the long game. "Oh, Avery, Mrs. Hayes," she stammered, recovering quickly. "You're back early." Her voice was calm, almost annoyingly conversational, utterly lacking the respect due to a woman 10 years her senior, and more importantly, the woman whose husband she was currently sleeping with. She had expected to see me eventually, just not today. The realization was stark. This wasn't a panicked one-night mistake. This was an established domestic routine. I let my heavy backpack slide from my shoulder to the floor. The sound was surprisingly loud, a final, definitive full stop to the fragile silence. "Yes, Chloe, I am," I said, my voice smooth, even. The calmness surprised me. It was the professional voice I used when a million-pound pitch was crashing down around my ears. Survival mode, detachment. She fiddled with the vegetables on the cutting board. She looked like a child playing house, a doll dressed in the owner's clothes. "Director Hayes said I could use the kitchen," she offered. Too quickly. The lie, a nervous tremor in her throat. "He's been working such late hours. I thought I'd cook him something healthy. Takeaway is terrible, isn't it? He needs better nourishment." I simply nodded, my eyes fixed on the olive branch apron tied around her waist. It was the garment I wore when I cooked for the two of us on a rare Sunday. It was a violation. Then, she committed the unforgivable act of hubris. She smiled, a small, patronizing curve of the lips, and delivered the sentence that had clearly been rehearsed, or, worse, told to her by Ethan. "Well, Director Hayes also mentioned something today. He said, the old one hasn't officially left, so the new one can't officially arrive." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of repeating his callous justification. It wasn't just a betrayal of my marriage. It was an insult to my intelligence, a deliberate attempt to wound me with his cruelty. For the first time since opening the door, a physical sensation broke through the analysis. Not pain, but a surge of pure, freezing clarity. I returned her smile. It was wider, sharper, and utterly devoid of warmth. I knew this smile had the power to stop a man's heart mid-sentence in a boardroom. "That's such a lovely piece of philosophy, Chloe," I commented, taking a slow step forward, closing the distance between us. "It speaks volumes about his character, doesn't it?" I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "But let me give you some strategic advice. The market is brutal, and loyalty is a myth." I paused for effect, letting her anticipate the strike. "Don't worry about being the new one, Sid dear. Because eventually, without fail, even you will become the old one." Her face went visibly pale, the practiced confidence dissolving into genuine shock and a glimmer of manufactured hurt. She bit her lip, forcing tears into her eyes. A classic defensive maneuver. instantly switching from aggressor to victim. Avery, I meant well. Ethan is under so much pressure at work. I just wanted to help him. You're gone so often, you know? He needs support. Perhaps you should try to be here more often for your husband. She was a master of the redirect, turning the blame onto my career, my absence, my 7 years of building the financial security that paid for this very apartment. Before I could answer, the front door swung open. Ethan Hayes walked in, his tie loose, looking genuinely stressed, but with a flush on his cheeks that wasn't from exertion. He stopped dead, seeing the three of us, the wife, the assistant, and the appalling silence, frozen in the kitchen. Avery, what are you doing here? You didn't call, he demanded, his voice instantly accusatory, avoiding any greeting or show of affection. He was trying to take control of the narrative, to make me the problem. Chloe, sensing her cue, started to tremble dramatically, clutching the olive branch apron to her chest. I'm so sorry, Director Hayes, she whispered, her voice tight with artificial distress. I should go. She dropped the knife loudly onto the wooden counter. It was a cheap, theatrical exit. She ran past Ethan, giving him a look that clearly communicated, "Rescue me. She's crazy." Ethan barely glanced at me. He was too busy watching the retreating figure of his young mistake. Why didn't you call? He repeated, louder now, his voice hardening with self-preservation. It was his desperate attempt to make me the culprit for upsetting the delicate, adulterous ecosystem he had constructed. I picked up the knife Chloe had dropped. I didn't hold it threateningly, just studied the glint of the steel under the kitchen lights, running my thumb gently across the dull side of the blade. If I had called, I said softly, my voice maintaining that professional, measured tone, you wouldn't have had this lovely home-cooked dinner waiting for you, would you, Ethan? He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping. The silence was the real weapon, and he couldn't handle it. Ethan's eyes, usually sharp and calculating in a negotiation, were darting now, from my face, to the discarded knife on the counter, to the front door where Chloe had just made her theatrical exit. He was searching for a script, an argument, a way to regain control of a scene that had spectacularly combusted. His face was pale, not with guilt, but with the shock of being caught in his own sloppy fiction. He was annoyed, not remorseful. This isn't fair, Avery, he finally choked out, his voice low, tight with grievance. You appear 3 weeks early, without a single warning, and you instantly launch an attack on my professional assistant. What kind of reaction is that? I was trying to run a simple, decent dinner for the girl. I placed the knife back into the block, deliberately, slowly. The small scraping sound echoed in the sudden silence. A simple, decent dinner that required her to wear my apron, sleep in your bed. Don't worry, I saw the linen set. It clashes terribly with your taste. And use my office to brew cheap instant coffee when you specifically hate instant coffee? I tilted my head, studying him with the detached curiosity I usually reserved for observing a deeply flawed competitor in the market. That's not a dinner, Ethan. That's a domestic routine. And since when is she so incredibly needy that she requires your personal chef services while I'm away? He paced 2 steps, rubbing the back of his neck, a gesture of deep stress, but I knew it was his performance of stress, designed to elicit sympathy. She's had a rough time lately. Her flatmate moved out. She's overwhelmed by the new promotion. I was helping her settle in, getting her oriented. I told you, Avery, she's young. She's vulnerable. I simply extended a helping hand, like a mentor should. His gaze flickered up, searching my face for the familiar crease of sympathy, the place where I always yielded. But today, that place was empty. It was concrete. You extended a helping hand right into my marriage bed, I stated, the words cutting through his flimsy explanations. Please don't insult my intelligence. I sign multi-million-pound deals daily. I can certainly read the data points on a duvet cover. She was wearing perfume that smells like a teenage candy shop, and she quoted you an amateur philosophical defense of polygamy. This is not mentorship, Ethan. This is pathetic. The word pathetic hit him harder than adultery might have. He recoiled, his self-image wounded. You're exaggerating this, he insisted, his voice rising in desperation. It was a mistake, a momentary lapse. We haven't been close in months, Avery. You're always on a flight. You're always talking about Q3 projections. You turned our home into an airport lounge and our marriage into a strategic partnership. This was just a consequence of that distance, and it's on both of us. The audacity of turning the betrayal into a consequence of my success, my tireless work to secure the life he had now comfortably settled into, was breathtaking. It solidified the freezing calm in my veins. He was not a good man who made a bad mistake. He was a self-serving man who chose convenience over commitment. So, my work is the flaw, but your assistant is the solution, I countered, letting the irony hang heavy. Do you remember why I was on all those flights, Ethan? Do you remember the hospital bills for your mother? The debts you accumulated trying to launch that first failed startup? I was the one who worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, to keep your dream alive. And you know what? I didn't sleep with my boss when I was exhausted. I came home and held your hand while you cried about your sick mother. The memory was painful, sharp, but bringing it up wasn't for me. It was to hold a mirror to his current cowardly self. He winced, the reflection too ugly to bear. He opened his mouth to argue, to minimize, to continue the blame shifting. But then, the sound came again. Beep, beep, boop. His phone, resting on the kitchen counter, flashed with an incoming call. The ringtone, that cheap, aggressively cheerful pop song I had heard earlier, the one that wasn't his style, signaled the caller. Chloe Abbott. Ethan glanced at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. The conflict was visible, but brief. The habit of protection, the new loyalty, won instantly over the old contract. He snatched the phone up, turning his back on me as he answered. His voice, when he spoke, was soft, gentle, infused with a patronizing warmth he hadn't used with me in years. It was the voice of a hero comforting the damsel in distress. Hello? Hey Chloe, are you okay? Where are you now? The sound of Chloe's voice from the other end was a calculated masterpiece of vulnerability. Even muffled, it was easy to picture her wide, tear-filled eyes and trembling lip. She was a professional at playing the victim, mastering the acoustics of helplessness. The street is so dark, Ethan, and my car is parked far away. I think someone is looking at me. I'm scared, and my mom is waiting. She's fragile, you know. I need to get home. Her voice, though strained, was perfectly audible, laced with a plea that only a man desperate to be a savior could resist. Ethan, it seemed, was not that man. No, don't move. Stay exactly where you are. In the light, Ethan instructed, his brow furrowed with genuine concern entirely reserved for her, not for the woman standing 3 feet behind him, a woman whose world had just been systematically dismantled. I'm coming right now. Just hang tight. Don't worry about anything. He hung up, the small, sharp click of the end call button sounding like the hammer falling on our marriage. He turned back to me, the keys already jangling in his hand, his coat still draped over the back of the dining chair. I have to go, he said, the words a rushed, frantic excuse, not a declaration. She's alone. She's terrified. I can't leave her on the street at this hour, Avery. She's just a child. I stood perfectly still, watching him move towards the front door. He didn't ask about my trip, my jet lag, or where I would sleep tonight. My long journey, my professional success, my sacrifice, all reduced to an inconvenience interrupting his rescue mission. So, your vulnerable, terrified assistant is more important than your wife who just discovered she's been betrayed in her own home? I asked. Not as a question seeking an answer, but as a final, factual assessment. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was already rehearsing his next round of lies, the excuses he would use when he finally decided to return to his primary residence. Don't make this difficult, Avery. I need to handle this situation. We can talk about us later. When we've both calmed down, I'll call you in the morning. Just try to relax. He didn't wait for a reply. He opened the door, slipped out, and pulled the door shut with a soft, final thud. The sound was deafening. He had left. He had left me, the evidence, the argument, and the 7 years of history, all for a frantic, manipulative call from a 23-year-old in distress. It was the moment of ultimate clarity. He had chosen, and his choice had nothing to do with love or hate, but with the gratification of being needed by someone new, someone who still saw him as a hero. I walked back towards the living room, my movements stiff, robotically precise. I didn't scream or break anything. The house was already broken, he asked. I walked past the misplaced magazines, the dented pillows, the apartment that had forgotten my scent, and headed straight to the balcony, the place where I had often stood to watch the vast, indifferent glow of London's financial district. The view, was spectacular and cold. 28 stories up, the world was a silent, miniature landscape. I spotted the white silhouette of his car immediately. He hadn't driven far. He was parked illegally just down the street, near the entrance of a quiet, upscale bistro. The streetlights bathed the area in a harsh yellow glow. And there she was, Chloe Abbott. She was no longer trembling. In fact, she was leaning casually against a lamppost, scrolling through her phone, her back ramrod straight, the picture of composure. The instant she saw the headlights of Ethan's car, the performance began again. She tucked her phone away. She stumbled slightly, holding her arms tightly around herself, shivering dramatically in the cool London night air. She looked around with wide, frantic eyes, the perfect picture of a damsel genuinely distressed. Ethan exited the car, rushing towards her with that same hurried, heroic gait. He was already talking, apologizing, perhaps, for being marginally late to her rescue. She launched herself at him, not a hesitant, grateful hug, but a possessive, full-body collision. Her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck, forcing his head down, and then their lips met. It was not a quick, awkward peck of two people sharing a sudden, illicit moment of passion. It was long, it was deep, it was unhurried and confident, a public declaration of ownership under the cold gaze of a street lamp. They swayed together, lost in their world, as if no one, certainly no one 28 floors up, could possibly be watching. They were consumed by the moment, by the secret, by the thrill of their own selfish universe. I watched, but I didn't see. My vision was a high-resolution, objective lens, recording data. The stone in my chest felt heavier. I raised my phone. I didn't zoom in. The distance added a necessary, crushing detachment. I held the phone steady, the night mode kicking in, focusing perfectly on the embrace below. Click. The first photo. Clear, undeniable, the street lamp perfectly illuminating the curve of Chloe's back, pressed against his chest. Click. The second, showing Ethan's hand, resting low on her back. Proprietorial, not comforting. Click, click. Two more, capturing the length of the kiss, their heads angled towards each other, confirming the intimacy. 4 perfect pieces of evidence. The act of taking the photos was not driven by revenge, but by a sudden, absolute need for self-preservation. It was the closing of a deal, the signing of a separation agreement. The contract of our marriage had been unilaterally breached, and I was simply documenting the terms of the termination. As I lowered the phone, another image, vivid and brutally contrasting, flashed across the cinema screen of my memory. It was 9 years ago. We were standing in the biting February chill outside the hospital where his mother was recovering from a critical surgery. Ethan was shivering, not from the cold, but from sheer terror and exhaustion. He looked fragile, broken. I remember pulling my worn cashmere scarf from my neck and wrapping it around his. He had held my hands, his eyes wet with tears. "Avery," he'd whispered, his voice thick with profound gratitude. "You're my only shelter. You stand by me when no one else will. I swear to you, I will never ever betray this. If I ever become that kind of man, the kind of man who would hurt you like this." He paused, his chest heaving, his breath clouding in the air. "I swear, I hope I get hit by a car. I deserve nothing less." He meant it then. He truly meant it. He was a good, frightened man whose dependence on me felt like a sacred bond. Now, standing 28 stories above the street, watching him hold a girl who was seeking to climb, not shelter, I looked down at the 4 digital photographs glowing on my phone screen. The oath, the desperate, sincere vow he made 9 years ago, had not prevented the betrayal. It had simply guaranteed its price. The words were not a threat anymore. They were simply a truth that had finally caught up with him. And I realized, with a strange, hard certainty, that the man who made that oath was gone. All that remained was the man I had just documented. The ashes of his promise were cold on my fingertips. I stayed on the balcony for what felt like an hour, though it was likely only 10 minutes. Long enough to watch Ethan help Chloe into his car, long enough to see the car pull away into the anonymous flow of London traffic, and long enough for the harsh yellow glow of the street lamp to feel like a spotlight on my sudden, brutal isolation. I didn't feel angry. Anger requires heat, requires investment. This was colder, deeper. It was the feeling of a massive, critical system failure, a profound emptiness, like an evacuated building. I walked back into the living room, the city's hum seeming to mock the silence in the apartment. I looked at the throw pillows again. They were just cushions, but they represented the 7 years of meticulous effort I had put into maintaining the facade of a perfect life, only to have a single, careless night reduce it to rubble. The pillows were round. I liked them creased. The difference was negligible, yet it was everything. It was the mark of someone who didn't care about my rules, my aesthetic, my sense of order. I walked into the bedroom. I needed my passport, my essential documents, and the small laptop I used for personal work, the one Ethan never checked. I didn't look at the bed. The sight of the perfectly flat duvet, the attempt to erase the foreign presence, was now more offensive than the sight of the lovers kissing below. It suggested a panic, driven by self-preservation, not guilt. He had cleaned up his mess, then left me to find the residual poison. I opened the drawer again. The harsh linen pajama set lay there, a stark, rough contrast to the empty space where Ethan's soft cotton shirt should have been. It was still wrong. It was still hers. I reached down and picked it up, holding the fabric between my thumb and forefinger. It smelled faintly of the cheap lavender and the sweet, cloying floral notes. L'odeur étrangère, right here in the most intimate drawer of my most intimate space. A wave of nausea finally hit me, the first physical sign of distress. It wasn't the sight of the pajamas that caused it, but the chilling realization of the deliberate, sustained invasion. He hadn't just cheated. He had brought her into our life, allowed her to occupy my space, wear my things, and consume his time and attention, while I was across a continent, building our future. I threw the pajamas onto the floor, the rough linen landing with a soft, insignificant thud. I was done with the analysis. I was done with the evidence. The clarity I had achieved was blinding, but it was also freeing. The marriage I had worked for, the security I had banked on, the man I thought I married, they were all illusions. The pain I felt now was the pain of finally seeing the truth, not the pain of losing a lover. I was grieving the woman I used to be, the woman who believed his oath. My mind drifted back, focusing on the core wound, the memory of sacrifice. I remembered the smell of antiseptic and cheap hospital coffee. It was 5 years ago. Ethan's mother was in intensive care, and the private care bills were astronomical. Ethan was useless, paralyzed by fear and guilt, unable to work. I had been his anchor, his banker, his emotional shield. I worked my day job, took on freelance marketing projects late at night, and then spent 3 hours every morning before work, sitting by his mother's bedside, holding her hand, telling her about the flowers in the park. I paid every single bill. I gave him the strength to face his mother's slow decline, and when she finally passed, I was the one who held him, his body shaking with grief and gratitude. He had looked at me then, truly seen me, and promised me the world, promised me fidelity, not out of passion, but out of absolute, eternal debt. And now, here I was, standing in the apartment that my sacrifices had purchased, looking at the detritus of his cheap, easy betrayal. He traded his absolute debt for a new, light-hearted transaction. The bitterness wasn't about sex. It was about the profound devaluation of my existence. He had not just broken an oath. He had erased 7 years of my life and called it a consequence of my ambition. My personal phone, which I had forgotten about, buzzed violently on the bedside table. Ethan. I picked it up on the third ring. I waited for the panicked apology, the desperate bargaining, the torrent of self-flagellation. It never came. Avery, listen to me. His voice was tight, low, and utterly devoid of remorse. It was the voice of a CEO managing a PR crisis. I'm at Chloe's place now. She's highly distressed, bordering on a breakdown. I need you to do exactly what I tell you, and you need to do it now. I almost laughed. The sheer, unadulterated hubris. He was still giving me orders from the scene of his crime, using his victim, the vulnerable young assistant, as his shield. And what exactly do you propose I do, Ethan? I asked, my voice remaining the calm, chilling soprano of a woman who has already packed her emotional bags. You are going to stay put. You will not call anyone. You will not text anyone. You will not contact a solicitor or anyone from the firm. And I know you saw something, but you're going to delete those photos right now. His voice hardened, shifting from command to threat. If you blow this up, Avery, you destroy us both. Not just the marriage, but my career. And if my career goes, your stability goes with it. Think about the house, the investments, the life we built. The threat was clear. Stay silent, or lose everything. He was trying to buy my compliance with the promise of shared financial comfort, the very thing I had built for him. I am currently standing in the kitchen, Ethan, I informed him. The knife your vulnerable assistant dropped is back in the block. The disgusting perfume scent is slowly dissipating, but it still smells like cheap desperation in here. And no, I haven't called a solicitor. Yet. He took that as a surrender. Good. See? You're smart. You know what's at stake. Just stay calm. I'll be back in the morning. We'll talk then. We'll figure out a way to smooth this over. Smooth this over, I repeated flatly. Like a wrinkle in a cheap shirt, Ethan? Or like a 7-year commitment broken by a 23-year-old on the kitchen counter? He sighed, an irritated, theatrical puff of air. Avery, don't be dramatic. I'm handling a crisis here. I'm asking you to be the mature one, be the adult. Oh, I assure you, I am being the adult, I confirmed. The adult who realizes she has been married to a small, weak, and pathetic man who is desperately trying to manage 2 women simultaneously to preserve his comfortable lifestyle. I took a deep, steadying breath. You can stay at Chloe's, Ethan. Don't come back here in the morning. Don't come back here ever. This apartment, this life, this debt you thought you repaid with an oath, it's all irrelevant now. A moment of silence stretched between us, and I knew the silence was not shock, but calculating fear. He realized his power play wasn't working. Avery, don't be insane, he finally whispered, the panic in his voice finally genuine. Don't throw everything away. Chloe means nothing. It was a lapse. You are right, Chloe means nothing, I agreed. And neither does your lapse. But your choice to abandon me tonight to comfort her, and then to threaten me with financial ruin, that means everything. That is the definition of the man you are now. And I refuse to be married to that definition. I didn't wait for his response, for the inevitable pleas or further threats. I ended the call. The silence that followed was heavy, complete, and glorious. The line was cut. The connection was gone. I didn't need a lawyer yet. I needed distance. I took the small, metallic hard drive from the safe, the one containing 7 years of shared financial records, the true, raw data of our lives. I placed it in my personal handbag. I gathered my passport, my wallet, and the 4 photographs that were already backed up to a secure cloud drive. I put on a dark trench coat, slipped my feet into a pair of comfortable leather boots, and picked up the suitcase I had left near the door. The only thing I forgot, and deliberately left behind, was my wedding ring, which I placed neatly on the nightstand beside the linen pajama set, 2 perfectly matched symbols of a broken contract. The moment I stepped out of the apartment, locking the door behind me, I felt a physical lightness. The air in the hallway felt clean, unburdened by the strange scent and the weight of 7 years of unreciprocated effort. I had walked into a house, expecting comfort, and found a prison of lies. Now, I was free. I descended the 28 floors in the elevator. It was late, but the streets were still busy with the residual energy of the financial district. I stepped out of the building and into the cool pre-dawn air of London. I hailed a black cab and gave the driver an address far from Canary Wharf, far from the life I was leaving behind. As the taxi pulled away, I looked up at the 28th floor. Our apartment window was a dark, blank square, indistinguishable from the thousands of others. The pain was not a sudden, sharp stab. It was a slow, deliberate shedding of dead skin. He thought the betrayal would kill me, or at least break me into compliance. But he was wrong. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the taxi window. The betrayal didn't kill me. It only opened my eyes. And sometimes, having your eyes opened is the only true form of rebirth. The city was waking up, a fresh, indifferent morning beginning to break over the Thames. I was one woman, alone in the back of a taxi, heading towards a completely unknown horizon. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew, absolutely, profoundly, that I was moving forward. The cab dropped me in Notting Hill, a neighborhood entirely different from the glass and steel fortress of Canary Wharf. I rented a small, airy flat overlooking a quiet garden square, and it was temporary, neutral, and devoid of history. Perfect. My first act upon entering was to check the drawers. No strange scents, no misplaced linen. The sheer relief was sickening, a measure of how deeply the violation of my space had wounded me. The absence of immediate, violent emotion was the most terrifying part of the fallout. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. Instead, I felt a massive psychological void. It wasn't the pain of a fresh cut, it was the chilling, hollow echo of an amputation. The wound had been cauterized clean by Ethan's final, selfish act of abandonment. He had saved me the mess of a dramatic confrontation by simply choosing the path of least resistance, away from me. I spent the next 48 hours setting up a new life, a new workspace, new routines, a new coffee shop, all operating on pure logic. My work became my sanctuary. I had an imminent pitch to a major healthcare client, and the absolute focus required to master the data, the projections, and the competitor analysis was the only thing that kept the psychological shutters closed. The life I lived was identical to the one before, only now it was free of the necessary, draining labor of maintaining the illusion of a happy marriage. Ethan started calling, not immediately after I left, but 6 hours later, after he had presumably stabilized Chloe and realized the extent of my calculated withdrawal. His first text arrived at 4:30 a.m. "Avery, I'm home. You need to come back. This is ridiculous. Let's talk rationally." His choice of words, ridiculous, rationally, was his signature move. He wasn't addressing my pain. He was managing a crisis. He was afraid I would make a scene, afraid I would do something irrational that would damage his professional reputation. I didn't reply. He called 5 minutes later. I let the phone ring, watching the display light up the darkened room. I noted the time, the duration of the ring, and the number of attempts. Data. I was treating the collapse of my marriage like a highly volatile, highly damaging operational failure that required cold, precise documentation. He called 3 more times before 8 a.m. When he finally sent a voicemail, his voice was tight with frustrated entitlement. "Avery, this isn't productive. You know how important my standing is at the firm. I need to be able to focus. I was wrong, yes, but running away doesn't fix it. It makes you look hysterical. I'm offering you stability. Come back, and we can figure out the financial terms. Just don't let this turn into a public embarrassment." The message confirmed everything. His apology was purely transactional. He wasn't sorry he hurt me. He was sorry I was no longer controllable. The promise of stability was his final, weak attempt to coerce me back into silence. He hadn't bothered to ask if I was okay, if I had slept, or if I had even eaten. I started my day. I dressed in the sharpest suit I owned, a dark gray power structure that felt like armor. I put on my most assertive lipstick. I left the flat and took the tube into the city. I was still Avery Hayes, the successful strategist, and the world would only see the armor. That afternoon, I had a scheduled all-hands meeting at a sister company in the financial district, a cross-departmental presentation of the Q3 projections. Ethan's company was adjacent, and occasionally we crossed paths in professional settings. I expected him to be there, but I hadn't prepared for the accessory. Ethan was standing in the foyer of the conference suite, greeting senior partners. He looked haggard, his face tight, his suit impeccable, but his eyes betraying a night of stress. He was performing competence, but the wires were frayed. And then I saw her, Chloe Abbott. She was standing slightly behind him, near the water cooler, wearing an expensive, ill-fitting dress that screamed, "Recently purchased with borrowed credit." Her hair was perfect. Her eyes, however, were wide and glistening, the picture of a fragile young woman forced into a public appearance. She was playing the role of the sympathetic, silent partner, the victim of the disruption. Ethan saw me first. His composure broke for a split second, a flash of pure terror, before the mask snapped back into place. He made a move to approach me, a hesitant, managerial stride as if I were a difficult client who needed smooth talking. I cut him off. I didn't break stride. I walked directly past him and Chloe, straight towards the boardroom, my gaze fixed on a point far above their heads. I didn't acknowledge their presence. I didn't slow down. I was a force of nature, and they were merely inconvenient weather patterns. But as I passed Chloe, she performed her masterpiece. "Mrs. Hayes," she whispered, her voice barely audible, thick with staged grief. "I'm truly sorry for the trouble." The word trouble, instead of pain or betrayal, was calculated, and it minimized the crime into a mere logistical inconvenience. I stopped. I turned my head just enough to look at her, my expression utterly blank. I allowed my eyes to drift from the bottom of her expensive shoes, up her trembling frame, past the expensive but cheap-smelling perfume cloud, and finally, meeting her wet, innocent eyes. My voice was a low, professional murmur, audible only to her and Ethan, who had moved closer, nervously watching. "Chloe," I said, using her first name, cutting through her formal Mrs. Hayes. "Trouble is a missing expense report. This is not trouble. This is poor strategic planning on your part, and profoundly poor judgment on Ethan's." I paused. letting the implication land. She wasn't a partner, she was a mistake on a spreadsheet. And one piece of advice, I continued, my gaze unwavering. Never confuse a man's weakness with your own strength. Ethan didn't choose you because you were better. He chose you because you were easier. That distinction will matter later. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a client waiting. Something, I suspect, you wouldn't understand. I turned back to the room and walked into the meeting without another glance. I had not screamed. I had not cried. I had used pure, cold professionalism to dismantle her status in one sentence. The meeting was a blur of numbers and strategy. I performed flawlessly. When I emerged 2 hours later, Ethan and Chloe were gone. They had retreated, unable to sustain the proximity to my cold, clinical anger. In the cab ride back to my temporary flat, the adrenaline wore off, and the void returned, vast and echoing. I realized I was not winning this battle. I was simply surviving it with dignity. The silence that now existed between Ethan and me was not just the absence of talking. It was the severance of all shared assumptions, all mutual understandings. He was communicating through threats and logistics. I was communicating through cold, absolute rejection. That evening, I started the physical process of separation. I opened the storage cupboard in the small Notting Hill flat. Inside was a single, cardboard box I had asked the building manager to retrieve from the Canary Wharf apartment. A box of memories. It contained artifacts of our history. The dried rose from our first date, a stack of handwritten letters from his mother, a few framed photos. I pulled out one picture, taken 5 years ago, shortly after we paid off the last of the hospital bills. We were standing in front of the flat, Ethan holding a bottle of cheap champagne, looking elated and free. He was leaning heavily against me, his entire posture radiating reliance. My arm was tight around his waist, supporting him, anchoring him. I looked at the photograph now, trying to find the man who made that profound, tearful oath to me, the man who was so terrified of losing me that he cursed his own soul should he betray me. He was in that picture, but he was unrecognizable. The Ethan in the photo was dependent, faithful, and afraid of failure. The Ethan of today was arrogant, entitled, and afraid of exposure. The transformation was complete. The silence in the flat was not peaceful. It was deafening. It was the sound of my future collapsing, but also the sound of the foundation for my new life being laid. I realized the only way to endure the silence that cut was to embrace the emptiness it left behind and fill it with something entirely new, entirely mine. The pain was still absent, but the realization was profound. I was completely and utterly alone, divorced from the man and the life I had known, long before any papers were signed. I looked at the picture again, remembering the intense physical labor of holding up his spirit during those years. The weight of that support now felt like a crushing burden I was finally free to drop. The price of his success, bought with my effort, was the cost of my freedom. I put the photo down and picked up the stack of his mother's letters. They were written in a delicate, looping hand, expressing deep, endless gratitude for my care. I began to read one, not for comfort, but for historical context. I needed to understand the environment that produced this weak, self-serving man. His mother, the only person he had ever truly relied on before me, held a key. I needed to analyze the origin of his trauma, his sense of entitlement, and his history of avoidance. The emotional phase was over. Now, the archaeological dig for the truth began. I was looking for the fault line, the weakness that made him choose the easy out, not just now, but perhaps throughout his entire life. The act of betrayal was not the start of the story. It was the predictable climax of a history of weakness. I settled into the tiny, unfamiliar armchair in my temporary flat, the cardboard box of curated memories open at my feet, and my goal was no longer emotional closure. It was forensic analysis. I was searching for the architectural flaws in the man I married, tracing the lineage of his profound weakness. The letters were frail, written on thin, elegant paper by Ethan's late mother, Ilara. During the hospital years, her notes to me were filled with effusive, heartfelt gratitude, acknowledging my tireless efforts as her son's anchor. But the separate stack of letters she wrote to Ethan, which I found carefully preserved and tied with a ribbon, were far more illuminating, revealing the source of the rot. They painted a picture of a sheltered boy whose sensitivity was validated above all else. "Don't worry about the university application, darling. I handled the fees. Just focus on your art," your beautiful, sensitive soul. Another, written when he was 24 and floundering. The investors were short-sighted, my sweet boy. It was not your fault. You're too good, too gentle for that brutal world. I will always protect you from failure. The letters were a voluminous, emotional security blanket woven from denial and boundless adoration. She had shielded him from every single consequence, validating his emotional state over his accountability. She had taught him that his comfort was the most important metric in the world, and that someone, first her, then me, would always step in to absorb the resulting chaos. The painful realization hit me. The great oath he made me years ago, the one where he swore to be hit by a car if he betrayed me, was not a promise of eternal love. It was a desperate, panicked plea for me to take over his mother's role. He wasn't afraid of hurting me. He was afraid of being left to face the world unprotected, afraid of the accountability that came with being a man. The betrayal wasn't a sudden lapse. It was the predictable climax of a lifetime of avoidance. My professional life remained a razor-sharp sanctuary, but outside of it, the silence of the flat was a palpable entity. Ethan's communication was relentless, yet utterly sterile. Not a single word of genuine remorse or self-reflection arrived. His messages were spreadsheets, disguised as texts, purely logistical and transactional. Avery, the Q3 account's password is changed. I need the old one. This delay is costing us. The bank statement for the joint mortgage is due on the 15th. Are you handling that, or do I need to reroute the payment? Need confirmation ASAP. He used the pronouns us and we constantly, clinging to the phantom of the partnership, but only when discussing shared liabilities or assets he needed access to. He was treating the physical separation as a logistical error, a temporary hiccup in the sophisticated financial machine of the Hayes life. I replied once, via encrypted email, ensuring there was a clear, unassailable paper trail. Ethan, all joint liabilities and asset separation will be handled by my retained solicitor, Mr. Jeffrey Cross, starting tomorrow. Cease direct contact regarding finances. This is no longer a partnership. It is a legal separation of assets. You can address all future inquiries to Mr. Cross's office. The response was immediate panic. He called, voice tied with wounded entitlement. Avery, don't be insane. Solicitors, that's for messy divorces. We agreed to keep this civil. This is going to destroy my capital. We could have handled this discreetly. He had begged me to be the mature one, the adult, the rational partner. But the moment I acted like a truly competent adult and outsourced the painful emotional labor of the split to a legal professional, he cried foul. His entire strategy had relied on my continued willingness to manage his chaos. My move had instantly neutralized his primary weapon, my responsibility. The next blow to my sanity came from the external environment, orchestrated not by Ethan, but by his vulnerable young accessory. I detected the move first on LinkedIn, a subtle, calculated leak. A former colleague, innocently congratulatory, forwarded me a post from Chloe Abbott's feed. It was a lengthy, professionally worded, but intensely personal update. She didn't name me, but the context was clear to anyone in the know. Endlessly grateful for the professional mentor, E.H., who helped me navigate a highly volatile, emotionally challenging work environment recently. The stress of dealing with certain individuals' unpredictable responses can be damaging to mental health. Choosing positive collaboration over unnecessary drama is key to success, even when faced with unfair accusations. Thank you for choosing professionalism, always. The post was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. It painted Ethan as the stable, professional mentor, the silent hero, and me as the volatile, unpredictable individual launching unfair accusations. It was a classic smear campaign, subtle enough to be deniable, vicious enough to be effective among those who only knew the surface-level stability of my marriage. She wasn't fighting for love, she was securing her new position, attempting to professionally assassinate the competition, to ensure her tenure as the new, functional partner was secure. I recognized the strategy instantly, the leveraging of perceived vulnerability for personal gain. It was manipulative, ruthless, and strangely effective in the current corporate climate. I didn't engage with the post. I didn't send a counter email or a defensive text. Instead, I used my expertise in market positioning. I quietly called a few key, highly respected contacts, people who knew my professional track record was unimpeachable. I didn't mention Ethan or Chloe. I simply finalized the Frankfurt deal, which was monumental, bringing in a contract worth triple the firm's quarterly goal, and strategically leaked the success story to a major trade publication, emphasizing the complex, rational, and emotionally detached maneuvering required to close the deal. The story ran 2 days later, positioning me as the sharpest, coolest head in the financial market. The headline, something about Avery Hayes' unflappable nerve, served as my unwritten response. The subtext was clear. A volatile, hysterical woman does not close deals of this magnitude. My professionalism became my defense, a silence so loud it drowned out Chloe's manipulative whisper. The effect was immediate. My stock, professionally, rose. Ethan's silence on my success was deafening. He couldn't congratulate me without validating the wife he had abandoned, and he couldn't deny my skill without damaging his firm's association with my proven competency. The betrayal was turning into a strategic, unplanned advantage for me. The true, horrifying nature of Ethan's failure was now perfectly clear. He was an avoider. He avoided emotional confrontation, financial responsibility, his mother's suffering, and now the messy, painful work of divorce. He was attempting to subcontract the emotional cost of his choices, just as he had subcontracted the nursing of his mother, the building of his savings, and the difficult conversations in the marriage. He had always seen me as a function, not a partner, the function that handled all the hard bits of life. The realization was crushing, not because I loved him, but because I had wasted 7 years enabling this perpetual adolescence. The burden I carried was not the loss of his love, but the 7 years of emotional labor I could never reclaim. The marriage didn't fail due to distance or lack of passion. It failed because he couldn't handle the proximity of accountability. I looked at Ilara's old letters again, the mother's shielding words echoing through the years. The wound of his betrayal wouldn't heal until I stopped playing the role of his shield. I was not responsible for preventing his self-destruction. I was only responsible for preventing the wound from passing to the next generation. The lesson, the pain of being the protector of a betrayer. This was the core of my personal revelation, the silent truth I had to embrace. I finally understood the true weight of the moral. We cannot stop others from betraying us, but we can stop that wound from repeating itself through the next generation. The next generation was me, the one about to be reborn. I looked out the window at the quiet garden square. I was no longer mourning a husband. I was finally mourning the loss of my own naive, exhausting role as his savior. The first few weeks in the Notting Hill flat were characterized by a severe emotional famine. I existed on a schedule so rigid it bordered on military discipline. 6 a.m. run, 7 a.m. coffee, 8 a.m. market analysis, 6 p.m. solitary dinner. The absence of Ethan was a vast empty space that refused to be filled. It was the silence, not of peace, but of a constant, suppressed scream. I was no longer fighting him. I was fighting the ghost of the life we had planned, the ghost of my own younger, more trusting self. Ethan's communication evolved from frantic crisis management to calculated psychological attrition. His texts now alternated between legal logistical demands, did you forward the investment portfolio access codes, and sickly sweet, manipulative attempts at reconciliation. I saw that amazing pitch on CNBC, Avery, you're brilliant. I miss that brilliance being next to me. I miss us. The I miss us was the most grating. He didn't miss me. He missed the utility I provided, the financial security, the intellectual sparring, the immaculate house, the shield from his own immaturity, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that he was sleeping in the same bed with Chloe while typing those disingenuous sentiments to me. The betrayal, I realized, was not a singular action. It was a habit. It was his default mechanism. I had been noticing, even before the big discovery, the relentless small shifts in his routine that were now clearly identifiable as covering his tracks. The sudden, inexplicable late meetings that cropped up on his calendar only to disappear mysteriously the following day. The new brand of aftershave, stronger, muskier than his usual scent, which he had clearly purchased to mask the strange, saccharine floral scent of l'odeur étrangère. One evening, my retained solicitor, Geoffrey Cross, arranged for a courier to drop off a small, final box of my personal effects from the Canary Wharf apartment. Mostly highly personal documents, old journals, and a few pieces of jewelry. I opened the box in the neutral light of my new living room. As I sorted through my things, a single, folded piece of cloth fell out of a tightly packed journal. It was the linen pajama set. The same harsh, unforgiving fabric I had thrown on the floor in disgust. But now it was folded. Folded clumsily, haphazardly, but folded nonetheless, and placed inside my box of memories. It was Ethan's panicked, sloppy attempt at historical revision. After I left, he had clearly rushed back, found the discarded evidence, and in a moment of frantic anxiety, decided to dispose of it by sending it away with my things, hoping I wouldn't notice. It was a bizarre, heartbreaking act of domestic criminality. He was trying to erase the physical trace of his infidelity by packing it away with the memory of his wife. I held the linen. It didn't smell of Chloe anymore. It smelled faintly of his home, of the detergent we used, of the air of our apartment. He had clearly washed it, trying to cleanse the crime scene, but the hurried, asymmetrical folding spoke volumes. It confirmed that he was in a state of perpetual panic, constantly working to conceal the truth, not from the world, but from himself. The thought of him, the director of engineering, kneeling on the floor, frantically folding the pajamas of his 23-year-old assistant to hide the evidence from his own wife, was profoundly pathetic. He was not a villain. He was a coward consumed by the need for plausible deniability. The sight made the heavy stone in my chest finally ache with a low, dull pain, not of loss, but of profound pity for his smallness. The physical separation was absolute, yet the emotional invasion continued. Chloe, the ruthless apprentice, took to using the corporate communication channels for subtle psychological warfare. She started sending emails to Ethan, deliberately CCing large groups, including me, now using my personal address, a clear attempt at harassment, that were filled with effusive, unprofessional praise for Ethan's emotional stability during a difficult period. She wasn't seeking validation from him, she was seeking professional validation from his peers, leveraging her perceived role as his loyal emotional support, positioning herself as the necessary, indispensable anchor. Her narrative was gaining traction. Avery Hayes was the volatile ex, and Chloe Abbott was the calm, competent successor. I continued to ignore the noise, focusing my energy entirely on the legal dismantling of our joint assets. My solicitor, Mr. Cross, handled the clinical, brutal work of severing the financial umbilical cord. Ethan, confronted by Mr. Cross's cool, factual approach, finally seemed to grasp the seriousness of his predicament. The realization that he could lose half of everything, the house, the stocks, the prestige, caused a breakdown in his composure. He begged for a face-to-face meeting, not for reconciliation, but for a financial bypass. Just meet me for coffee, Avery. Please. We can bypass the lawyers on the house. We can settle this amicably. We don't need the expense and the publicity. His voice pleaded over the phone, the desperation finally stripping away the last remnants of his managerial facade. I agreed, not because I was weak, but because I needed to see the final, broken architecture of the man I had once loved. I needed the final, decisive nail in the coffin of my illusion. We met at a sterile, glass-fronted cafe near the Thames, a neutral zone that felt appropriate for a negotiation between corporate enemies. He arrived looking stressed, but overdressed, wearing a tie I hadn't seen before, a nervous energy vibrating off him. He launched immediately into the excuses, a torrent of self-pity and minimizing. Avery, I made a mistake. I know, a huge one. But you have to understand, you were gone for so long. There was a void. And Chloe, she was just there. She was convenient. She needed help, and I provided it. She wasn't sending a gift. She was sending the literal scent of the crime, a calculated, malicious reminder of her victory and my violation. She was confirming her tenancy in my professional and domestic space. The old me, the Avery the protector, would have shattered, collapsing under the weight of such a crude, effective humiliation. The new Mia walked slowly to the bathroom. I looked at the bottle, recognizing it now not as a symbol of sex, but as a symbol of power, her desperate need to establish dominance. I unscrewed the cap and held the bottle over the sink. I did not smell it. I simply inverted it and poured the entire cloying liquid down the drain. The sweet scent mixed with the chemical smell of the sink cleaner I was using. It was the only ritualistic act I allowed myself. I watched the poison wash away, swirling down into the sewer system where it belonged. The small act of cleansing, triggered the final, shattering clarity. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the clean white tile, suddenly feeling the full, accumulated weight of the past 7 years. I remembered the long nights at the hospital, the frantic work I did to cover his debts, the years I spent absorbing his anxiety, telling him he was strong, telling him he was competent, telling him I would handle it. I had been his mother's replacement, the ultimate shield against the cruel, challenging world. And what was the consequence of my unwavering protection? It was that he never had to grow up. It was that when real failure or real temptation arrived, he was fundamentally incapable of facing it. He chose the easy exit, betraying the very person who kept him safe, because she was the only person he could hurt without immediate, career-ending repercussions. My loyalty had not saved him. It had actively enabled his weakness, paving the soft, predictable path to his downfall. The moral I had been circling finally solidified into an unshakable inner truth. We cannot stop others from betraying us, but we can stop that wound from repeating itself through the next generation. The next generation wasn't a biological child. It was the next iteration of Avery Hayes. The wound would repeat if I chose another man who needed rescuing, or if I returned to the belief that my strength could be perpetually leveraged to compensate for another's inherent, chosen weakness. The betrayal, in its cruelty, had been a painful, necessary surgery that removed the flaw in my own character. The need to be the indispensable savior. The emotional vacuum that had been plaguing me finally ceased to exist. It was no longer a void left by Ethan's absence. It was a clean, expansive space, quiet and full of potential. The silence was the sound of my soul finally resting. I was no longer listening for his needs. I was listening for my own voice, the voice of the woman who existed before I became his shield. I decided I needed to retrieve one final item of purely sentimental value, a small, leather-bound journal containing my original career aspirations, written before I met Ethan and before his financial needs subsumed my independent dreams. It was a testament to the woman I was meant to be, independent of his narrative. I went back to the Canary Wharf apartment one last time, accompanied by Mr. Cross as my cold, legal chaperone. It was the first time I had set foot inside since that night. The air was heavy, stale, and empty. Ethan was not there, having been expressly forbidden to be present. The apartment looked alien, already stripped of shared identity, like a museum exhibit of a failed partnership. The high-end furniture looked cold and temporary. I walked through the rooms, feeling a profound, relieving numbness. I walked into the study and retrieved the journal from my locked file drawer. As I was leaving, I glanced at the kitchen counter. Ethan had left a crumpled, hastily written piece of paper. Against Mr. Cross's quiet, professional advice, I picked it up. It was a final, desperate note of self-pity. Avery, I'm sorry I was weak. I never wanted this. I'll never forgive myself. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. I hope you find happiness. The old Avery would have clutched the note, wept over his pain, and found a sliver of hope in the self-flagellation. The new Avery saw it for what it truly was, a cowardly apology that still centered the entire narrative on his weakness and offered nothing but the burden of his unforgiveness of himself. He still required my sympathy. Even now, he was asking me to carry the weight of his guilt. I folded the paper neatly, walked to the large recycling bin under the sink, and dropped it in. I didn't burn it. I didn't tear it. I simply placed the emotional trash in the appropriate receptacle. The act was definitive, clean, and utterly unemotional. I looked out the massive window at the London skyline. She wasn't sending a gift. She was sending the literal scent of the crime, a calculated, malicious reminder of her victory and my violation. She was confirming her tenancy in my professional and domestic space. The old me, the Avery the protector, would have shattered, collapsing under the weight of such a crude, effective humiliation. The new me walked slowly to the bathroom. I looked at the bottle, recognizing it now not as a symbol of sex, but as a symbol of power, her desperate need to establish dominance. I unscrewed the cap and held the bottle over the sink. I did not smell it. I simply inverted it and poured the entire, cloying liquid down the drain. The sweet scent mixed with the chemical smell of the sink cleaner I was using. It was the only ritualistic act I allowed myself. I watched the poison wash away, swirling down into the sewer system where it belonged. The small act of cleansing triggered the final, shattering clarity. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the clean, white tile, suddenly feeling the full, accumulated weight of the past 7 years. I remembered the long nights at the hospital, the frantic work I did to cover his debts, the years I spent absorbing his anxiety, telling him he was strong, telling him he was competent, telling him I would handle it. I had been his mother's replacement, the ultimate shield against the cruel, challenging world. And what was the consequence of my unwavering protection? It was that he never had to grow up. It was that when real failure or real temptation arrived, he was fundamentally incapable of facing it. He chose the easy exit, betraying the very person who kept him safe, because she was the only person he could hurt without immediate, career-ending repercussions. My loyalty had not saved him. It had actively enabled his weakness, paving the soft, predictable path to his downfall. The moral I had been circling finally solidified into an unshakable inner truth. We cannot stop others from betraying us, but we can stop that wound from repeating itself through the next generation. The next generation wasn't a biological child. It was the next iteration of Avery Hayes. The wound would repeat if I chose another man who needed rescuing, or if I returned to the belief that my strength could be perpetually leveraged to compensate for another's inherent, chosen weakness. The betrayal, in its cruelty, had been a painful, necessary surgery that removed the flaw in my own character, the need to be the indispensable savior. The emotional vacuum that had been plaguing me finally ceased to exist. It was no longer a void left by Ethan's absence. It was a clean, expansive space, quiet and full of potential. The silence was the sound of my soul finally resting. I was no longer listening for his needs. I was listening for my own voice, the voice of the woman who existed before I became his shield. I decided I needed to retrieve one final item of purely sentimental value, a small, leather-bound journal containing my original career aspirations, written before I met Ethan and before his financial needs subsumed my independent dreams. It was a testament to the woman I was meant to be, independent of his narrative. I went back to the Canary Wharf apartment one last time, accompanied by Mr. Cross as my cold, legal chaperone. It was the first time I had set foot inside since that night. The air was heavy, stale, and empty. Ethan was not there, having been expressly forbidden to be present. The apartment looked alien, already stripped of shared identity, like a museum exhibit of a failed partnership. The high-end furniture looked cold and temporary. I walked through the rooms, feeling a profound, relieving numbness. I walked into the study and retrieved the journal from my locked file drawer. As I was leaving, I glanced at the kitchen counter. Ethan had left a crumpled, hastily written piece of paper. Against Mr. Cross's quiet professional advice, I picked it up. It was a final, desperate note of self-pity. Avery, I'm sorry I was weak. I never wanted this. I'll never forgive myself. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. I hope you find happiness. The old Avery would have clutched the note, wept over his pain, and found a sliver of hope in the self-flagellation. The new Avery saw it for what it truly was. A cowardly apology that still centered the entire narrative on his weakness and offered nothing but the burden of his unforgiveness of himself. He still required my sympathy. Even now, he was asking me to carry the weight of his guilt. I folded the paper neatly, walked to the large recycling bin under the sink, and dropped it in. I didn't burn it. I didn't tear it. I simply placed the emotional trash in the appropriate receptacle. The act was definitive, clean, and utterly unemotional. I looked out the massive window at the London skyline. The sun was setting, casting a fierce orange glow over the financial district, the light reflecting off the steel and glass. I saw the faint outline of the street where he had kissed Chloe. The memory held no power. It was an objective fact, like the mortgage rate or the Q3 projection. I turned to Mr. Cross, a slight, genuine smile finally touching my lips. Let's go, Jeffrey. I'm done here. I closed the door on the apartment, closing the final physical chapter of that life. I walked out of the building and into the cool, sharp air of London, hailing a cab. I didn't look back at the apartment. The betrayal was complete. The grieving was over. The rebirth had begun. I was ready for Act 3. The final, definitive cutting of the cord. The silence was absolute, and for the first time in years, it felt like the sound of profound, unearned peace. The wound would not repeat. The weeks following my final visit to the Canary Wharf apartment were the quietest of my life. My temporary flat was a cocoon of calm efficiency. I worked, I ran, I read, and I managed the complete, forensic dismantling of my marriage. I didn't see Ethan. I didn't speak to Ethan. The only interaction was the cold, formal communication routed through Mr. Cross, my solicitor, who handled Ethan's increasingly frantic, financially driven demands. Ethan was learning, slowly and painfully, that his crisis manager, me, had gone on permanent strike. I spent countless hours with Mr. Cross, compiling the ultimate, unassailable case. It was a strategy session worthy of a hostile takeover. I provided the documented timeline of the infidelity, the screenshots of the public kiss, the texts showing his abandonment, and, most critically, the detailed records from the external hard drive, the true picture of our financial codependency, the years of my salary disproportionately funding his career, and our shared lifestyle. My goal wasn't merely a fair divorce. It was a psychological and legal strike that would force him to confront the structural weakness of his choices. "We have everything, Avery," Mr. Cross concluded during our final review meeting in his cool, leather-scented office. "The documentation of his abandonment, combined with the evidence of your financial support during the crucial years, puts us in a dominant position. We will seek a settlement that reflects the emotional labor and the lost opportunity cost of your dedication to his career. He will be served with the papers tomorrow." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of clinical satisfaction and profound detachment. "When is the best time to serve him, Jeffrey? Professionally, that is." Mr. Cross, a man who understood the strategic value of timing, checked his notes. "His firm is hosting the annual Investor Relations Gala tomorrow evening. A key event. He'll be surrounded by his peers and the very clients he needs to impress. I suggest the papers are delivered to his office at 4:30 p.m. It gives him precisely 30 minutes to digest the news before he has to put on a tuxedo and perform competency for the entire market." "Perfect," I said. "Let the public reality begin." The next evening, I sat alone in my flat, staring at the muted London news on my small television screen, waiting for the expected fallout. I wasn't waiting for an emotional breakdown. I was waiting for the system's failure. The silence was broken precisely at 5:02 p.m. My personal phone, which had been silent for weeks, exploded with calls, not just from Ethan, but from his personal number, his work number, and even a blocked number. I let them all go to voicemail, watching the screen light up with the frenzy of his disintegration. His texts, which followed the unanswered calls, were a chaotic torrent of panic, moving rapidly through the 5 stages of grief in 15 minutes. 5:05 p.m. Denial. "Avery, what the hell is this? This is insane. Call your solicitor off. This is a joke, right? I am literally walking into the gala now. Stop this now." 5:08 p.m. Anger. "You manipulative bitch. After everything I did for you, you think you can just destroy my life like this? You will regret this. I will drag this out for years." 5:12 p.m. Bargaining. "Avery, please, think about the financials. We can settle. I'll give you the flat. I'll give you the stocks. Just keep the lawyers out of my professional life. This is going to ruin me. I'm begging you. Name your price." 5:15 p.m. Depression. "I can't believe you would do this to me. I thought we were partners. I thought you cared, adversary. I'm alone, Avery. I'm completely alone." I read the texts with the same detached focus I applied to reading a difficult client's risk assessment. The most telling part was the absence of a single, sincere statement of remorse for the betrayal. His pain was entirely self-centered. A catastrophic fear of loss of status and money, and the man who had hoped to be hit by a car for his infidelity was now terrified of a legal process that would make him financially accountable for his choices. His moral compass had been completely replaced by his personal balance sheet. I deleted the texts instantly. I was done with receiving his garbage. I sent one final message to Mr. Cross. "Ethan Hayes is now entering the bargaining phase. Do not yield. Proceed with the previously agreed strategy." Later that night, around 11 o'clock p.m., a message arrived from an unexpected source. "Chloe Abbott." It was a cold, venomous text to my professional email address. From Chloe Abbott, subject, professional courtesy. "I sincerely hope your vindictive actions haven't ruined Director Hayes' reputation tonight. He has worked tirelessly for years, and this pathetic attempt at revenge is beneath a woman of your supposed caliber. Don't worry, I was there tonight. I stood by him, supporting him through this unnecessary drama you've created. We will be fine. You, however, look like a desperate, unstable woman who can't handle being replaced. I'm forwarding this email to several of your colleagues as evidence of the emotional volatility you've displayed. Good luck with your career, Avery. The message was an act of pure desperation on Chloe's part, a final, vicious attempt to leverage their shared secret into professional stability. She was fighting not for love, but for a title, a position, a replacement life. She truly believed that by standing by him, she had secured her place as the new, functional partner. She saw the divorce not as a tragedy, but as a promotion. This time, I felt a flicker of emotion, but it wasn't anger. It was an amused contempt. She was playing amateur hour politics, using predictable, traceable channels to launch a threat. She had misunderstood the core dynamic entirely. She was still trying to hurt Avery the wife. She had forgotten she was dealing with Avery the strategist. I immediately forwarded Chloe's email to Mr. Cross, with a single instruction: add this to the harassment file. Her statement proves her active participation in the professional damage and validates the volatility of the relationship he chose. Use as leverage if necessary. Then, I replied directly to Chloe, CCing absolutely no one. Subject: professional courtesy. Chloe, thank you for confirming your presence and support at the gala. It's valuable information for my solicitor. Regarding your assessment of my caliber, my actions are not vindictive. They are fiscally and legally responsible. I am securing the assets I earned, which you and Ethan seem to believe are expendable for the sake of his ego. Regarding your decision to stand by him, I wish you luck. You are currently standing with a man who betrayed his first partner to minimize his financial accountability. Your position is less partner and more human shield. Be aware that the role of the protector is exhausting, costly, and ultimately unrewarding. I resigned from that position, and now you have inherited the debt. I recommend you focus on your own career, as your stability is entirely contingent upon his capacity to pay for your shared existence, something that is about to become significantly more challenging. I will not wish you luck, because luck plays no part in strategy. The only choices, and you have made yours. Avery Hayes. I sent the email and closed my laptop. The exchange was definitive. I was no longer fighting for my marriage. I was defending my financial and professional borders from a hostile, coordinated incursion. Chloe's attack had simply provided me with more ammunition, solidifying my position as the rational, unassailable professional. The final act of the evening came around 2:00 a.m. Ethan showed up at my Notting Hill apartment. He didn't have the key. He was buzzing the intercom relentlessly, his voice slurred and thick with drink and desperation. Avery, open the door. We need to talk. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But you can't do this to me. Think about the bank. Think about what this does to our retirement. I love you. I promise I'll change. I'll leave her. I'll do anything. His voice was a torrent of chaotic apologies, interwoven with desperate financial pleas. I love you. And think about the bank were uttered in the same desperate breath. Even in his moment of collapse, his remorse was conditional, a tool of manipulation. He didn't love me. He loved the stable, secure life I represented. He was willing to discard Chloe to preserve his comfort, not to atone for his sin. I stood silently, watching the video feed of him, disheveled and drunk, pounding on the outer door of the quiet, respectable flat. I let him rage for 5 minutes, allowing him to exhaust his final pathetic performance. Then, I walked to the intercom, pressed the talk button, and spoke one final, clear sentence. Ethan, you have your lawyer's number. Do not contact me again, or I will file an immediate restraining order. I hung up. I watched the video feed as he staggered back, his shoulders slumping. He looked small, weak, and utterly abandoned. He was finally facing the consequences of a life spent avoiding them. He didn't have a plan B. He only had Chloe, the new human shield, and the realization that his old shield was not only gone, but was now leading the legal assault. He left 10 minutes later, stumbling into a waiting cab. I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street, bathed in the soft London nightlight. The confrontation was over. The point of no return had been crossed. The line of betrayal, once a painful scar, was now the clean, sharp edge of my freedom. I felt nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of self-respect. The morning after Ethan's desperate, drunken visit to my apartment, a profound silence returned. But this silence was different. It was the calm after the storm, the moment when the debris settles and the extent of the damage becomes clear. I knew his performance was over. The game of control, the push and pull of guilt and finance, had ceased. He had exhausted his theatrical repertoire, and all that remained was the cold, hard process of legal separation. Mr. Cross called me later that day with the first reports from the gala fallout. Ethan's attempt to project competence had failed spectacularly. He had been visibly shaken, drinking heavily, and eventually left the event early, leaving the senior partners to speculate. The firm, which prided itself on stability and discretion, was already reviewing his role, but the truly devastating blow came from an unexpected source, Chloe Abbott. "Your assistant's email, Avery," Mr. Cross informed me, his voice sharp with professional admiration. "The one threatening to forward the details to your colleagues? It was a major, catastrophic misstep on her part. I presented it to Ethan's firm, citing it as proof of intentional corporate harassment and character assassination directly connected to the domestic conflict. We suggested that her proximity to the director, coupled with her active role in the attempted professional defamation of a highly valued industry figure, you, constitutes a serious liability and a breach of professional conduct." The result was immediate. The firm, prioritizing its own reputation and terrified of a potential lawsuit involving corporate harassment and financial drama, acted swiftly. Chloe Abbott was placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full internal review. Her audacious attempt to secure her position by attacking me had backfired, destroying the very foundation of her leverage, Ethan's proximity and status. She hadn't been fighting for love. She had been fighting for a desk, and she had lost the chair. The sheer irony was staggering. I had spent weeks ignoring her amateur attacks, and then, with one calm, strategic countermove, I had neutralized her completely. She thought she was leveraging Ethan's affair. I simply leveraged the firm's fear of my competence. The entire fragile structure they had built, Ethan's comforting lie of victimhood and Chloe's aggressive pursuit of status, was collapsing not due to my emotional pain, but due to my superior strategy. Ethan's next communication, relayed through his lawyer, was no longer a negotiation. It was a cry of desperation. He was panicking about Chloe's employment status, suddenly realizing that her stability was now his problem, a financial and emotional burden he had acquired precisely at the moment his own career stability was crumbling. He was facing a massive, complex divorce, while simultaneously managing his mistress's loss of income. He had traded an anchor for a parasite. I felt a quiet, profound pity for Chloe. She had chosen a man who would abandon his wife, and then, when the pressure mounted, would leave his vulnerable mistress to handle the fallout of his choices. She had become the new shield, the new receptacle for his chaos, and she was quickly realizing the cost of the role. I had warned her. The role of the protector is exhausting, costly, and ultimately unrewarding. Now, she was learning that lesson the hard way. My solicitor and I proceeded with the legal finalization. Ethan, broken and compliant, yielded quickly once he realized the depth of our documentation, particularly the proof of my financial sacrifices for his mother and his failed startup. He couldn't fight the evidence. He couldn't afford the prolonged exposure. The settlement was swift, clean, and entirely in my favor, reflecting the immense emotional and financial cost of the years I had spent stabilizing his life. The apartment in Canary Wharf, the one where the strange scent had first assaulted me, was sold, and I watched the transfer of funds, a clean, massive digital entry in my bank account. The money wasn't a victory. It was compensation for 7 years of lost self-focus. It was a receipt for the emotional labor of holding up a weak man. With the legal process nearing completion, I allowed myself a single, final moment of self-reflection. I had navigated the crisis flawlessly. I hadn't succumbed to rage or revenge. I had relied on my intelligence, my professional detachment, and my relentless pursuit of accountability. The pain I had felt, the emptiness, the profound sense of isolation, was now replaced by a quiet, immovable self-respect. One rainy afternoon, I found myself walking through a quiet, small park near my flat. I saw a young couple sitting on a bench, leaning against each other, sharing an umbrella, whispering secrets. They looked so young, so trusting, so utterly consumed by the naive belief in their own invulnerability. I watched them, and instead of feeling bitterness or envy, I felt a deep protective instinct for the younger version of myself. I wished I could whisper to her, "Trust the data, not the emotion. An oath is only as strong as the man who gives it." I realized I no longer needed Ethan's remorse, Chloe's downfall, or the legal victory to feel whole. My wholeness was inherent. The betrayal had not diminished me. It had simply removed the dead weight of a relationship that was built on my willingness to be a savior. I decided to take a physical, symbolic step to mark the end of the psychological ordeal. I went to a high-end jeweler I had frequented years ago, one who knew my tastes. I didn't go there to buy anything. I took the wedding ring from my purse, the one I had left on the nightstand and which Mr. Cross had retrieved along with the final documents. It was heavy, a thick platinum band representing 7 years of perceived permanence. I placed it on the velvet display cushion in front of the jeweler. "I would like to have this melted down," I told the assistant, my voice perfectly steady. "I don't want it remade into another piece of jewelry. I want the platinum reduced to its simplest form, a small, perfect, unshaped disc. I want the final result to be nothing more than pure, clean material, something that has no history, no shape, and no memory." The assistant, a polite older woman, looked at the ring, then at me, sensing the profound finality of the request. "A powerful decision, madam. It will be simply a blank coin of pure metal. It will be the beginning of something new." "Exactly," I affirmed. "The absolute end of one form, and the simplest possible start of another. No new narrative yet. Just the raw material." The act was profoundly liberating. I wasn't destroying the ring in anger. I was recycling the material, acknowledging its worth while neutralizing its symbolic power. It was the final, definitive step in preventing the wound from repeating. I was ensuring that the material representation of his broken oath would not be passed on, even to myself, in a new disguised form. It would be elemental, clean. I left the jeweler's, feeling lighter than I had in years. The betrayal was no longer a personal affront. It was a chapter in my history, a dark period I had navigated with unflappable nerve and devastating clarity. The silence I walked into was mine, and mine alone. It felt like the sound of the world finally starting again, on my terms. I was no longer a victim or a warrior. I was simply Avery Hayes, the architect of her own solitude and, finally, her own peace. The last stage of the divorce, the official signing of the papers, was now only a formality. My rebirth was complete. Word count: 3020. Tongso 2, Tuanbo Kitban Hotwai, 5844. Tongso 2, Tuanbo Kitban, 247 Mime. The day the divorce was finalized was unremarkable. It was a gray, typically overcast London morning. I dressed not in a power suit, but in a comfortable deep navy cashmere dress, a deliberate choice to communicate serenity, not combat. The final meeting was at Mr. Cross's office, a sterile affair designed for maximum efficiency and minimal emotional bleed. Ethan was not present. He had signed his documents in his own lawyer's office the day before, a final act of avoidance that was perfectly consistent with his character. The contract was terminated. The emotional shield was formally laid down. I sat at the vast, mahogany table, Mr. Cross presenting the final documents, with a solemn, respectful air. I read the closing paragraphs, not for the legal jargon, but for the finality of the language. The marriage is hereby dissolved, and the parties shall henceforth be single and unmarried. I took the expensive, well-balanced pen and signed my name, Avery Carter, for the first time in 7 years, with a hand that did not shake. But it was not an ending. It was an execution of a meticulously planned exit strategy. Mr. Cross pushed a small, plain envelope across the table. "This arrived for you this morning, Avery. From the jeweler." I knew what it was. I opened the envelope. Inside, nestled in a small pouch of velvet, was the material representation of the new me, the platinum. It was not a ring, not a necklace, not a piece of jewelry with any form or function. It was simply a small, dense, perfectly smooth disc of pure elemental platinum, a blank coin. The weight of it in my palm was disproportionate to its size, heavy, cold, and immensely satisfying. It was the absolute purification of the symbol of the broken oath. The memory was neutralized. The material was reclaimed. "The purity of the metal is quite stunning," Mr. Cross observed quietly, sensing the profound significance of the object. "It is," I agreed, sliding the coin back into the velvet pouch and placing it in my purse. "It's the raw material. No history, no narrative, just potential." I stood up, shaking Mr. Cross's hand, offering him a sincere, deep thank you. He was the tool of my liberation, the cold logic that had guided me through the fire. As I left his office and stepped into the elevator, I looked at my bare left ring finger. It was pale, a distinct line marking where the platinum had rested for so long. The absence was the most palpable feeling, but it was not a feeling of emptiness. It was the lightness of a burden lifted. The finger was now simply a part of my hand, belonging only to me. The next morning, I woke up in my quiet flat and did something I hadn't done in years. I changed my long-term career plan. For 7 years, my professional life had been subconsciously tethered to Ethan's schedule, his public relations, and the financial necessity of maintaining our joint lifestyle. My ambition had been channeled to serve our stability. Now, I was free to focus solely on my own trajectory. I secured a new high-stakes position with a boutique firm specializing in turnaround strategy, a role that required frequent, intense travel, global autonomy, and absolute dedication to my own success. It was a life I would have hesitated to pursue before, fearing the distance it would put between Ethan and me. That fear was gone. The distance was the point. 2 weeks later, I was at Heathrow, standing at the gate for a solo flight to Tokyo, a city I had always wanted to visit, but had never managed to reconcile with Ethan's travel schedule. As I waited, impeccably dressed and perfectly calm, I was scrolling through my professional newsfeed. An item caught my eye, a brief, factual report on the restructuring at Ethan's firm. It was subtle, but the subtext was clear. He was moved sideways, stripped of most of his operational authority, relegated to a less visible, less volatile role. His professional wings had been severely clipped, a direct consequence of the volatility his private life had created. The firm had chosen stability over his perceived talent. I felt no satisfaction, only a quiet confirmation. His lack of accountability had finally caught up to him. He was not destroyed. He was simply diminished, placed back in the gentle, cushioned box his mother had prepared for him, a life where external pressures and high-stakes choices were minimized. He had gotten the peace he craved, but it was the peace of irrelevance, not true rest. As I closed my laptop, I looked up. Across the vast crowded terminal, near a check-in desk for a flight to a minor European hub, I saw him, Ethan Hayes. He looked older, heavier. The stress of the past few months settled deep in the lines around his eyes. He wasn't wearing one of his tailored, expensive suits. He was in casual, rumpled clothes, looking like a man who had lost his moorings. And next to him, her shadow, Chloe Abbott. She was no longer the sharply dressed, aggressively confident young professional. She looked tired, strained, leaning heavily on her small suitcase. There was no saccharine scent of victory around her, only the visible fatigue of being the full-time emotional manager for a diminished man. Their dynamic had shifted completely. He wasn't looking at her with pride or desire. He was looking at her with an exhausted, demanding dependence. He was leaning into her space, talking quickly, desperately, and she was responding with a practiced, weary patience. She was now the shield, the receiver of his anxiety, the one paying the price for his arrested development. They were not a picture of passionate love or triumphant partnership. They were a picture of mutual, miserable codependency. The betrayal had not led to happiness for either of them. It had merely swapped the roles of the caregiver and the dependent, replacing one victim with another. I watched them for a long moment, without recognition, without judgment, as if observing two characters in a tragedy I had mercifully exited. He was exactly where he belonged, reliant on a fragile replacement who would soon discover the full, crushing weight of the burden I had carried. They were trapped in the repetitive cycle of his weakness. I turned away before either of them could notice me. I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want the performance to start again. They were no longer relevant to my narrative. I walked toward my gate, passing through the automatic barrier and onto the jetway. I felt the powerful, clean surge of the aircraft's engines vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. It was the sound of escape, the sound of forward momentum. I ran my fingers over the velvet pouch in my purse, feeling the cold, hard certainty of the platinum coin. I was heading to Tokyo, to a new firm, to a new life built solely on my merit, my strategy, and my own absolute self-reliance. I had faced the deepest betrayal and refused to let it contaminate my future. Looking out the small airplane window, as the tarmac blurred into motion, I closed my eyes and allowed the final, cleansing voiceover to emerge. The core truth purchased at the cost of 7 years. We invest so much of ourselves in preventing the pain, in protecting those we love, believing that our strength can compensate for their weakness. But the lesson is brutal. We cannot be the shield for a man who chooses to be small. The betrayal was his choice. The consequence was mine to manage. And by managing it with cold clarity, by refusing to be the victim, by letting the wound calcify into resolve, I did the only thing that mattered. I stopped the cycle. I stopped the wound from repeating itself. He traded loyalty for convenience. I traded a marriage for myself. And sometimes, the most profound love you can find is the love you finally show to the generation that needed it most, the version of yourself you're reborn to be. The plane lifted off, soaring high above the overcast city, cutting through the dense, gray atmosphere and bursting into the pure, blinding white of the cloud tops. The light was absolute. The future was unwritten. Avery Carter was finally free.